Welcome in. This is the Deployment Dudes, episode 3. I am your host, Scott Hutter, joined by my co-host, Phil Fannin. How we doing, Phil?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing great.
Awesome.
What are we talking about today?
I think we are talking about 1099 and W-2, the differences between those, pros and cons.
Right. So if you are a consumer of IT field services or have worked in IT field services, you should tune in today because this is probably, at least my opinion, the question I get asked the most working in this industry.
No doubt.
Yep. RFP, RFQ, RFI, it's usually the very first question. So let's dig in. To start, why do people ask this question?
I think it's a quality issue, to be honest with you. I think there is a preconceived notion that W-2 employees is a better model because I think most people believe you have control if they're a W-2 employee.
Yeah, I would. I think there is that preconceived notion W-2 good, 1099 bad. But I think it's an important question to ask, but there's a lot of layers of the onion that you have to peel back because I've seen both models work really well and then both models fail miserably.
Of course.
Yeah. So let's start with 1099 because that's where you've primarily been for our careers. Let's start there. What do you see as the pros of that model? And for the context of this conversation, let's use a large multi-site restaurant technology rollout. Let's say you want to do 1,000 sites in a year. So we'll use that as the framework for this.
Okay.
What are the pros of that subcontracted 1099 model?
One of the pros that jumps out at me initially is your flexibility in a 1099 model. The reason I say that is because when you are modeled the way that we are and you have a whole lot of options nationally, if we're going to let's condense this down to national and forget global for a moment. The flexibility that we have is, think of it in terms of, I want to use the analogy of baseball, of a bullpen. We've got a lot of pitchers that we can pull from in a lot of different cities. In a W-2 model, you're very limited in that capacity. So if you're W-2, you're rolling out 1,000 sites. They can only be in so many places at once, right? And that's one customer. What about all their other customers? How do they service that? Now, maybe they're multi-layered. Maybe they've got a number of W-2s in NFL cities, and so they've got depth and capacity there. But what about in all of those other locations? We're using restaurant as the example. Restaurants don't always have to be in the high metropolitan areas, right? And so you've got these outliers. So to answer your question, my opinion, number one, pro for us in the 1099 model is flexibility.
Right. Flexibility from a capacity perspective, but also from a skill set perspective, right? So going back to your baseball analogy, you're going to look at who that bullpen pitcher is going to be up against and then select your, whatever kind of pitches they throw.
Right.
Where for this rollout, you may have W-2s in that NFL city or wherever the restaurants are located, but does that W-2 have that exact skill set? You may have to do additional training, but with the 1099 subcontracted model, you could have a pool of techs that are really good at low voltage cabling, techs that are really well versed in point of sale. So that model and that pool gives you more options to match the project with the skill set.
You're right, but let's be fair in what you had just said. If you're rolling out a IT deployment project for restaurant, you hopefully know what your SOW and your skills are going to be required. If it's a cabling project, maybe it's multifaceted. Maybe it's cabling, maybe it's installing access points, and there's point of sale all rolled up into one. Mm-hmm. I do agree with you in terms of making sure that you're matching the skill set to the scope, and where that could range, maybe all, to your point, maybe all sites aren't getting the exact same thing. Maybe some of them have already gone through a wireless access point upgrade, or maybe some of them have already gone through a point of sale upgrade. And so you've got different requirements that are happening on site. So you're matching the skills to the project itself. And so I believe that a 1099 model allows us to be able to select specifically by site what the scope is and then put the matching skill set in the restaurant to complete that scope.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Now let's talk about with the 1099 model, there's definitely some risks or pitfalls and there's certain things you have to do to mitigate those risks, right? So let's talk about some of the pitfalls of that model. Then, what you've seen us do over your career here, contingent to mitigate those risks from that 1099 model.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, like the risks of like techs not being booked for a full day or not having the right skill set, or it's the first time they're doing this job, like things that you do with the 1099 because they're not your people to mitigate that.
Okay,
Having
so
a
I'm
good
looking through the
project
lens of
manager.
1099, not
You,
W-2.
you are,
What
yeah.
you're saying?
We're still on 1099. So
Okay.
like the bad actors out there, right? You could talk about that. Like
Yeah.
there are risks to it if you don't do it right, but the way to do it right is to put these things in place to mitigate those risks.
So, okay. Yeah, I completely understand.
So that's the pros of that 1099 model, but it also does come with some risks or some pitfalls that need to be accounted for. And there's certain ways that you can handle those to mitigate that risk of the project. What are those pitfalls in your opinion, and what steps should organizations take to mitigate them for a rollout?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad it's coming up because what we do in any 1099 model is incredibly difficult. It's hard, and maybe this is why the W-2 question comes up a lot because maybe besides just quality, maybe there is this other preconceived notion that W-2 means that these technicians, they've already been through the training, they already have their expectations, and they've that just comes with the territory. For example, in a 1099 model, there's a ton of work behind the scenes that I think a lot of people don't ever get to see of what's required. It's almost like, back to my analogies, now I'm on Wizard of Oz. Oz behind the curtain, right? Pulling all of these levers, pushing all of these buttons, making smoke happen, and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's essentially what is going on. If you're doing it correctly, that's what's going on behind the scenes in a 1099 model. Trying to be sure that you have thought through methodically all of the pitfalls that can occur with the human element in a 1099 model, going through a contractor or what have you, and making sure that you're setting them up for success. It's a lot.
It is. There's a lot of orchestration that goes into it, right? And I think it starts with the selection and the vetting process and making sure you're asking the right questions so their skill set matches up with the task at hand. And then to your point, equipping them with everything they need to be successful on site. And that starts with vetting, what tools are required do you have to bring with you? Giving them a full, thorough install script step by step with certain milestones that makes it easy for them to navigate through that installation and set them up for success.
Absolutely. One of the other things that I was going to say is, in that whole vetting process and in this 1099 model discussion that we're having, um, you know, just like in the W-2 world, not all W-2 companies are cut from the same cloth, if you will, or are built the same way. They may not attack the business the same way. Same in the 1099 model. Like, so for example, with us, a lot of our success is driven not just by the project coordinators and the project managers that we have going on behind the scenes and all of the training that they have done, setting up POs, work orders, scripts, SOWs, all of that kind of stuff, but also the depth of partners that we have to go to. I think it's very possible that there have been some 1099 modeled companies out there that just doesn't have that many options to choose from, because the onboarding process for that, as you know, is incredibly daunting, right? You got to get an MSA, you've got to go through background checks, you've got to make sure that they've got all the right insurances. The list for that just goes on and on and on. And so I would say that it's possible some of those designs and those companies that are set up as a 1099 could, not saying this is all, but could get lazy in the sense of, okay, if I can go to somebody that's covering a lot of region here and I can use somebody else that's got a lot of region here, and I can start to marry that in together, and I've got 10 or 15 partners now that covers, quote unquote, the United States. That's not enough, as we know, because you have things that, well, I mean, you have to be able to handle the volume coming in. Unless you are incredibly disciplined and saying, okay, you know what, I can't take on these projects right now because I'm working this one, and then when it's done, but whoever knows what's coming in behind that, right?
Right.
So I feel like you have to be designed and prepared to handle additional volume, and only way you can do that is to have a large number of pitchers in the bullpen.
Okay, let's talk about the W-2 model now, because just like the 1099, it has its pros and its cons. So, and like you said, some companies do it really well, others don't. It's just like the 1099 model. There's companies that do that really well, and some that don't. With the W-2 model, what is it about that model where it can work for something like this?
W-2 has its place, no doubt, and I certainly don't want us to come across that we're, looking down our nose at anybody that is designed in the W-2 model. It most certainly has its place. It does bring a level of consistency, generally speaking. I think anytime you're in the W-2 model and you're hiring these technicians, they're going through an interview process, and that is probably very consistent, right? They've got a group of people that's all they do is interview and onboard these technicians, and then make sure that they're set up and equipped, and maybe they've got their onboarding package. They get a van, they get all of the necessary tools, to start. They are equipped to be able to carry additional equipment around. Maybe it's extra cabling, maybe it's, and it brings that same look and feel, if you will. So I think there's a lot of appeal and applause that you can direct towards the W-2 model in that sense. I also think, though, it lends itself, in my opinion, I don't know this for sure, but when I think about that model, I almost feel like it could lend itself to allow the coordinators who's managing those W-2s to get lazy, perhaps. Maybe because they've been through that training, maybe because they have their own truck, maybe because they have their own, doesn't necessarily mean they are automatically equipped to go out and be successful on any given project. And so I could see where maybe they take advantage of that, and technician goes in and it maybe is blind, even though W-2. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that blind trust, right? Because they've been through that onboarding and that vetting process. That you might not have your finger on the pulse as much from a project management or coordination piece. There's that blind trust that where they're just letting them be self-sufficient, when you do need those controls to make sure that there's consistency across a large rollout like that. And then also you're getting the documentation from those project coordinators and managers and keeping everybody in the loop on what's happening at that particular location.
Yeah, so how I think I would wrap this up as a summary is, for anybody out there that has listened to this podcast and has seen or experienced both models, the W-2 and the 1099 model, by asking the question, how are you designed? I would encourage everybody to continue to go deep into those questions. Don't be fooled by just the common boilerplate answer back. Dig in. Ask the right questions. How are you set up? Who is doing the tracking? What's that tracking model look like? How are we going to be getting reporting? What do you do when things go awry? How do you handle and manage those crisis situations? Because these projects, they're incredibly important, and putting people on site and being there in the restaurant, to our example, a lot can go wrong. And so, my opinion, asking those questions and really digging in and trying to understand what happens behind the scenes about any organization that you're expecting to partner with is critically important.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, these technicians that are being put into the restaurants in this hypothetical situation, they're not only an extension of companies like us, but an extension of that restaurant's IT staff, right? They're representing that IT staff to the employees, to the guests, if there's guests in the restaurant during that time. So it's critically important to dig in on that and ask additional questions beyond that to really understand the model, how they're preparing these techs, training them, etc.
Yeah, and I even like the idea for anyone listening that is in search of these types of services. Be willing to do a pilot. Be willing to put people to the Pepsi challenge. Is a phrase I like to use a lot, just to see can they do what they say they can do. And we obviously know that most people are going to put their best foot forward in a pilot scenario, but you can usually tell. You know, if you given enough sample size to enough organizations, maybe you pick 3 and you say, okay, I'm going to give this group 5 sites. I'm going to give this group 5 sites. I'm going to give this group 5 sites. And then just start to compare, see how do they communicate with you? How do they build out their schedule? How are they tracking these technicians? How are they giving you the updates of what's happening in the field? What do their deliverables look like, and how does that come back to you? What's the invoicing look like? And also, since we're on that subject with pilots, I love the fact that throw some serious curveballs, especially if you know that your project is going to encounter curveballs. You don't want pilots going perfectly right out of the gates, right? I think you want to throw as many curveballs as you possibly can at the very beginning in the pilots, because you want to know how do they handle them, because this is a real life scenario. It can't all be just a perfect scenario and then get into production rollout and find all of these things that you didn't know going into pilot. And so now you've got these major problems.
Yeah, don't give them the brand new shiny restaurant. Give them the one that was built back in the 70s that has a rat's nest in it and is a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, rat's nest, not hypothetical.
Yeah, hypothetical.
Rat's
It's not
nest.
an actual
Not an actual real rat's nest.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, that's a wrap on 1099 versus W-2 and Deployment Dudes episode 3. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.